International Trade, Module 3, the World Trade Organization. Origins. The World Trade Organization deals with global norms that govern the trade among nations. Its main function is to ensure that trade is conducted in the most fluid, predictable, and free way possible. After the end of World War II, there was a strong need for structuring a mechanism for international economic cooperation that would help to ensure peace in the international community. For this reason, it was decided to create a body within the United Nations that manages all issues related to international trade, as well as another sector that is responsible for managing the issues related to the reduction of customs tariffs. In this way, the idea of initiating a liberalization of international trade markets appeared. It encouraged the economic growth of all countries through transparency, predictability, and stability of the international trade order. So before the 1930s, there was enormous uncontrolled trade protection measures to deal with the global economic crisis, and then a narrowing of economic ties and union of the nations in joint development projects. Dual trends in international trade. The one is the general agreement for projection towards the achievement of greater economic wealth. And then the countries have been introducing obstacles to limit trade freedoms in this way. They managed to move toward the common objective of economic wealth. And for some of the reasons were as follows: economic independence, national security, less competitive protection of the domestic industry, tax collection, inflationary policies, regulations of the international workforce market. Right. So these are obstacles to limit trade freedom. Right. And because of this ambiguous trend in the interest of different countries, there was this great need to generate international regulatory mechanisms that are homogeneous and beneficial for everyone. So then we came up with the Havana Charter in 1948, and this is the first document created to design a system that encompasses the aforementioned elements. The development of an international trade organization started taking shape, but it did not come into force since no agreement was reached with the U.S., who was very reluctant due to the fear of losing omnipotence in decisions concerning the foreign trade policy. Nonetheless, an agreement was reached after lengthy negotiation on the reduction of custom tariffs. This is a general agreement of tariffs and trade. From 48 to 94, the general agreement established the rules, applications of large parts of the world trade. And during this period, there were times when some of the highest growth rates in international trade were recorded. However, despite its appearance of solidity, the General Agreement of Trade during those 47 years was an organization of a very provisional nature. Well, here are the principles: the non-discriminatory business treatments. Any advantage, favorite, privilege, or immunity granted by any member to any product originating in or designed from any other country shall be accorded immediately and unconditionally to be the like product originating in and designed destined for the other member countries. The reduction of an elimination of tariffs and other measures that countries maintain to protect their domestic production should be reduced, and where possible eliminated through negotiation among member countries, and the reduced tariffs should be bound against further increases. And the national treatment, that when imported products have entered an internal market, they must be treated in the same way as other domestic products. That is to say, there is no internal discrimination. And there's a prohibition of quantitative restrictions. The use of any type of quantitative restriction, whether quotas, imports, or export licenses, is prohibited. These are the general rules. Now, the GATT trade rounds. During the existence of the GATT, the series of negotiative rounds were carried out, resulting in a series of agreements, and these agreements are related to the reduction of tariffs on trade items between countries, and they are outlined in the box below, and they're extracted from this place. Here they are. All about tariffs, and then we talked about, and we had countries who signed on to this, and then coming up to 1973, non-tariff measures, framework agreements, and up to 94, non-tariff rules. Yes. At this point, the creation of the World Trade Organization originates through a proposal in Canada, seconded by the European Union, which concludes that there is a need to organize a stable configuration which is self-sufficient and has decision-making power so that it can charge on new fronts of international trade. It can take charge. Founding principles of the World Trade Organization remain the pursuit of open borders, the guarantee of most favored nation principle, and non-discriminatory treatment by and among members, and a commitment of transparency in the conduct of its activities, the opening of the national markets to international trade with justifiable exceptions or with adequate flexibility will encourage and contribute to sustainable development, raise people's welfare, reduce poverty, and foster peace and stability. At the same time, such market openings must be accompanied by sound domestic and international policies that contribute to the economic growth and development according to each member's needs and aspirations, which is sort of the general vision of the World Trade Organization. Here is an overview of the objectives: the legal framework that is unified and monitors the implementation of agreements, adaptation and adaptability to respond to new economic fronts, in which least developed and emerging countries should play a more active role. Ecology, making a fundamental objective, which is growth of wealth through the expansion of international trade, compatible with ecological concerns, of course. Structuring regulations on issues related to labor rights, human rights, and making sure that they are accepted and homogenous among member countries. Access to markets, agreeing on strategies that help achieve a liberalization of international trade, thus avoiding trade policies that promote discrimination and competitive disadvantage. Here's the general structure of it. The ministerial, the dispute settlement, the general councils, and the various committees. For talking about anti-dumping, that sort of thing, and committees for trade and services. Interesting word, plurilaterals. Anyway, the ministerial conference, the general council. Let's see. I think maybe I'm seeing. Oopsie. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Okay, so what we have here is the ministerial conference. The ministerial conference is a supreme decision-making body with the World Trade Organization, made up of representatives of all member countries, which are all obliged to meet at least once every 2 years. An entity makes decisions on each of the issues related to the multilateral trade agreements. The General Council is of the World Trade Organization. It's the highest level decision-making body in Geneva, meeting regularly to carry out the functions of the World Trade Organization. It has representatives, usually ambassadors or equivalent from all member governments, and has the authority to act on behalf of the Ministerial Conference, which only meets about every 2 years. The current chair is Xavier Karim. This is old news, of course. And the General Council has two mandates, the Dispute Settlement Body and the Trade Policy Review Body. At the same time, it includes three bodies that administer and manage different aspects of international trade. Council for Trade Goods, in trade and services, trading goods, trade and services, and the rights to intellectual property. International jurisdiction. Well, as a body responsible for resolving disputes, it is responsible for controlling the World Trade Organization. Dispute settlement system, the development of this body has been a great advance in the World Trade Organization since it is a specialized body in the resolution of various disputes that arise from member states. That is why it can be said that it is a judicial body. It constitutes a source of international law and has the authority to impose economic sanctions on the member countries of the organization, that becoming the only organ of contemporary international law. Process of resolving disputes, differences. Parties involved in conflict begin relevant consultations as period one. Then if there's a failure, the parties move to three members chosen by the World Trade Organization, and they must present their views. And it's almost impossible to be able to reject the conclusions, as it is necessary to obtain an agreement among all member states. Now, the members, since 2016, it has had 164 members, and then 20 are holding observer status. And when it comes to countries in the European Union, it's been decided that the power of negotiation in that context, the World Trade Organization, is the European Commission. The current member countries, well, here's rather the long list. Here are the observers. Oh, you know what I should have really done? I just had a quick look and see if the United Kingdom's in. I don't see United States, so United States is in. Okay. I imagine Canada's in right from the get-go, but anyway, let's have a quick look. Yeah, I would say so. Okay, here we are now. Those are some other countries coming along. Maybe some of them are now in. Iran and Iraq. Well, and here's now a country. Considered to be its own country. Except for the Holy See, the observers must start negotiations for accession within a period of 5 years after obtaining observer status. There's a group of international organizations that are identified as international observers. And here they are, the UN, of course, the World Banks, many organizations here, International Monetary Fund. And here are the areas of negotiation and positioning: the agriculture, first country to export farm products under the international level. Its foreign policy aims to increase the global market share in that sector because of the need to reduce its trade deficit, something that Mr. Trump is working on even as we speak. the existence of leading multinational organizations in the sector which research the openings of new markets, whether for their own products or for the productive expansion. The United States has the privilege of having great national advantages, particularly in the territory in the Midwest. These advantages allow it to have production levels similar to those of the Cairns Group. It has also succeeded in combining this advantage with an international agricultural policy, which supports the agricultural sector in order to maintain farmers' incomes and the form of rural production based on policies of policy of prices such as milk and sugar, or means of direct aid to the product sector, as in the case of cereals and beef and pork, etc. And this double feature of the American agricultural sector, production and subsidies, and perceived as an aggressive element within the international agricultural negotiations, since it influences on the one hand the less developed countries with higher productivity, and most developed countries with the most subsidized structure. On the other hand, the U.S. has to face other countries regarding the spread of genetically modified crops that are more productive and can competitive advantage over the least developed countries. However, the effects of food choice are still unknown, and at the same time, which is carried out in more flexible intervention on prices of sanitary control, which cheapens the final price of the product and also creates uneven competition in relationship to the wholesale rigor of the EU agricultural policies. Now, the European Union and the blemish of it are that it has much less productivity or less efficient agricultural model than the U.S. or the Cairns Group, and it has established its community based on the agricultural projects such as a way as to have ensured agricultural supplies, acceptable prices for producers and consumers, and also to define a project of a rural development that preserves the environment. The European Union has disputes with the rest of the world due to the subsidies and protection nature of management in the agricultural sector. Now we come to the Cairns Group. It is an organization of 20 very different countries, which at the same time have very similar features. Most of them belong to the American continent. Most of them are recent creations. They have several competitive advantages, and climate, of course, Chile and New Zealand, great space, and that would be Canada and Australia, and richness of soil, and that would be Argentina. The countries that belong to the Cairns Group, here at the entire list, you can see them. There's a few here, like Pakistan's in there somewhere, and Thailand, Vietnam. Each of these countries has a competitive edge of the agricultural sector at the international level, and all of them want to achieve a more liberalizing system, which would allow them to compete in the major centers of consumption, which of course is the US and the EU. The elements that impede these countries from full liberalization are as follows. Canada, it has some very subsidized sectors such as milk. Chile has very high tariffs in some sectors. And Australia and New Zealand, office, and I don't really know what that means. So an explanatory table of the member countries of Cairn. Okay, let's see if we can get down here to Australia. Oh, yeah. They look like they might even have. No, they don't. Okay. The service sector is the fastest growing sector of the world economy, and it also represents 2/3 of the worldwide production, 1/3 of global deployment, and about 20% of world trade. The World Trade Organization aims to achieve enlargement of the trade liberalization in international services, since they are the future of wealth creation. In 1994, a general agreement on trade was created, which is the first and only set of multilateral rules that regulate international trades in services. This organism was negotiated in the Uruguay round, and it was developed firstly as a response to the large growth of the service economy in the past 30 years, and secondly, to the potential of services as a result of revolution of communication. The General Agreement on Trade in Services provided that all countries should present a list of services that are exposed to potential competition from investors or foreign companies. On the other hand, each party has the function of reserving a particular sector protected against foreign competition. Because of the great multiplicity of interest in developing a common procedure due to the competitive situation, a complex scenario arises in the service sector. The European Union continues to maintain certain basic principles that limit the widespread liberalization with the aim of maintaining the cultural diversity and concept of public service, and less developed countries analyze with concerns their release of services, since they do not possess a solid structure developed in the sector, which could lead to disappearance of domestic companies engaged in the sector. The most developed countries are in favor of the opening of large parts of the sector of services, since they have large business groups with a high level of international competitiveness. The United States encourages opening and full liberalization of the sector so that multinationals in that sector are benefited, thus enhancing the liberalization process of all sectors. Now we come to intellectual property. Intellectual property rights are the rights given to persons over the creation of their own mind. They give to the creator an exclusive right over the use of their creation within a certain period of time. The negotiations of intellectual property is divided into two large main sections. One is called copyright, authors of literary artistic works, producers, actors, and those related to industrial properties, distinctive marks and signs, logos, and that sort of thing. And then World Trade Agreement on Trade Aspects of Intellectual Property, the TRIPS, as protection of intellectual property, was created and negotiated in that first round. It was an attempt to reduce the differences to protect those rights in the different countries of the world by adapting them to international standards. And this agreement was reached in the conference at Marrakesh. Okay. It resulted in a series of limitations concerning the access of technological innovations by developing countries. On the other hand, an increased investment of a technological nature in less developed countries took place thanks to the production offered by these new regulations of legal order set out in the recipient countries of the technology. And this effect can be explained considering that nowadays technology is the main driving force in development, and indeed, and at the same time, it is a cause of great inequality between the most developed countries and the less developed ones, which have become mere buyers of the technology created and produced by developing countries. The TRIPS is established through a series of phases that allows developing countries to adapt to the new demands of international trade. So here's what happens. In 1996, the more developed countries begin to implement these agreements. Least developed countries encouraging exchange and support. Developed countries, national treatment, both foreign and national companies will be treated equally. Most favored nation clauses there. A minimum protection for patents of pharmaceutical chemical products emerged. Now in 2000, it was applied to developing countries, except the least developed countries. And then there was an amendment for the pharmaceutical sector, an amendment to extend and perpetuate the previous negotiations, and it is applied to the least developed countries. The application of TRIPS gives rise to disputes between rich and poor countries, as there is a great legal incompatibility established by the World Trade Organization. So now we come to the pharmaceutical sector. This is one of the sectors that has been modified by the World Trade Organization, since the right to health in crisis stands above commercial rights. An amendment of TRIPS was established in this sector, and it implies the obligation to suspend the patent of a specific medicine for the production of generic medicines in case of a health emergency. And in addition to authorizing these countries to be able to carry out importation of such medicines if they cannot produce them. Now we come to the ecology. In the current international economic context, one of the most important components is environmental protection. In recent decades, great waves of contemporary thought express the difficulties of achieving a balance between economic growth and protection of the planet. And the World Trade Organization has incorporated into its program the search for the balance between the world trade and the environmental protection. It carries out a number of protective measures regarding customs exchange that fall into 6 main categories: human life, fauna and flora, plant life, animal life, human life, environment, and general security of the planet. Sustainable development and protection of the preservation of the environment are key objectives of the World Trade Organization. They are included in the Marrakesh Agreement and to complement the objectives of the World Trade Organization to reduce barriers to trade and eliminate discriminatory treatment in international trade relations. Where there is no specific agreement dealing with the environment, members may adopt trade-related steps that meet a series of measures for protectionist purposes. The DOHA agenda includes specific negotiations regarding trade and environment, sets forth tasks for the Committee of Trade and Environment. International Trade, Module 3, Part 2, Ecology. In the current international economic context, one of the most important components is the environmental protection. In recent years, the great waves of contemporary thought express the difficulty of achieving a balance between economic growth and protection of the planet. The WTO has incorporated into its program the search for the balance between world trade and environmental protection, carries out a number of protective measures regarding customs exchange that fall into 6 categories of human life, fauna, flora, plant life, animal life, human life, environment, general security of the planet. The protective measures of the WTO within the ecological framework can be varied in nature. Quantitative restrictions, which would be quotas, financial measures, security deposits that can be recovered, tax, this is if there's an oil spill or something, tax measures, custom fees, technical measures, inspection obligations to meet ecological standards, import licenses, and prohibitions. All of this seems to be flying straightly against everything else that I've just read. The measures of protection features. The main goal should be the protection of the environment. They must be sustained with a scientific basis, and this justifies the measure. They should not be of a discriminatory nature or represent interests that do not correspond to the environmental responsibility, and it is necessary to perform a general notice of commercial limitation that will be used and reasons for supporting it. Now, social regulations. WTO not only deals with the economic and financial aspects, but it also refers to the social aspects and the worker protection. The International Labor Organization is responsible for promoting social justice as well as human and labor rights recognized at the international level. Labor peace is essential for prosperity. Today, it enables the creation of decent jobs where labor and economic conditions allow workers and employers to contribute to a lasting peace, prosperity, and progress. Here now is the mission of the ILO. Promoting and complying with the standards and fundamental principles of rights to work, International Labor Organization, I believe that is, creating great opportunities so that women and men can have opportunities, decent income, enhancing the coverage and effectiveness of Social Security for all, strengthening tripartism and social dialogue. Now, we come to the WTO conference, the Uruguay round. Uruguay round was one of the longest negotiations, as it took 7 years. It took place within the framework of the global and laid foundations for the WTO. There were 123 participants, and it included almost all the trades. The discussion topics were agricultural service, intellectual property, textiles, and investors abroad. Participants agreed to reductions in import duties on tropical products in only 2 years. The rule for the settlement of disputes was also reviewed, and some measures were implemented immediately. In addition, periodic reports on the trade policies of the GATT members were established, which were vitally important to achieving transparent trade regimes all over the world. One of the points that was agreed upon in the Uruguay round was the need to achieve greater liberalization of the markets in the agricultural sector. And at the same time, 3 fundamental pillars for their scope of progress were established in the agricultural context: agricultural export subsidies, access to markets, domestic support for agriculture. Innovative points of the Uruguay round, Uruguay round regarding the agricultural sector: prohibition of new agricultural subsidy policies. The political measures of support for the sector have been classified according to the scale of possible acceptance by other countries. More respect for the established agreements and laxity regarding the decisions of retaliation among different countries. The duties customs are the most important means of protection for national governments. This type of measurement refers to the prohibition of other discriminatory guidelines regarding foreign products, which are also more difficult to control. This section assumes a greater transparency in the international management of the sector and access to more reliable data to reach international agreements. And all of the achievements have helped to create an optimal framework for future discussions, although there has been no progress in the production levels of international agricultural production markets. Now, Singapore. This was the first conference organized by the World Trade Organization. One of the main objectives was the implementation of agreements reached in the Uruguay round. It was decided to create 3 working groups: trade and competition, trade and investment, and transparency of public markets. And its ministerial declaration includes the following aspects: delay in the adoption of the broad lines of agreement that had been understood by WTO and GATT in the earlier times by some countries. In an increasingly liberalized scenario, developing countries have difficulties benefiting from the advantages of world trade, so measures to support those countries have to be taken. A major blockage into the progress of the negotiations on access markets in the sector services was established: financial, maritime, movement of natural persons, telecommunications, movement of natural persons. I think that was mentioned twice there. Anyway, to achieve a great liberalization of international trade, the importance of promoting regional arrangements and multilateral type agreements is highlighted. Then we come to Geneva. Geneva, of course, very famous. During this conference, a report of the 3 previous agreements that were signed in 1997, in the field of telecommunications, financial services, and information technology was drawn up. What is more, an interim agreement concerning the field of electronic commerce was reached. And then we come to Seattle, and during this conference, following were agreed to as the main objectives: investments, transparency of the public market environment, social norms, and competition. And the results of this meeting were considered an authentic failure, since the minimum consensus on outcomes to be obtained was not reached. This is the one in Seattle, yeah. The causes of the failure: lack of consensus, especially in the agricultural sector, U.S. and Europe. The North-South debate between developing and developed countries. The developing countries were calling for a more active role, and they refused to endorse the imposition of agreements that were no more than applications from previous conferences and which did not respond to the real needs and concerns of these countries. The U.S. limited its objectives and interventions in the conference solely to topics related to agriculture and services. Further reasons for the failure: the least developed countries rejected the idea of including new standards of environmental and social nature, since they are interpreted as mechanisms for protectionist measurements of their own markets. Yeah, and there is a movement in international public opinion that wants the WTO to not only focus on negotiating the liberalization of trade flows, but also to begin to target the major challenges of international society, such as human rights, their way of work, ecology, etc. Now we come to the DOHA. This conference came as is needed the minimum agreements that would prevent another failure of WTO, which could lead to a major crisis in the organization and could call its viability of the organization into question. Yeah, Doha is the name of a city in the land of Qatar, the country of Qatar. And that's where the conference took place. Anyway, it came as a need, minimum agreements that would prevent another failure, which could lead to a major crisis organization and call its viability into question. Anyway, here were the topics. Removing subsidies, especially those linked to the EU, establishing no date to launch the initiatives, improving access to the agricultural markets, especially in the least developed countries, reduction of subsidies to agricultural production, reduction of domestic support in the sector. The services, a phase of demand for opening up the services market of other countries, another phase of opening up the services of each country, and an increasing countries developing trade in services. As far as the environment goes, a process of negotiation between companies is opened in which the agreement will not be assigned to countries that have not signed agreements relating to the problem Kyoto. In a way, this limits and nullifies practical applications to the agreements made. This result represents a failure of the position that the EU wanted to adopt on environmental issues. Social regulations refer to the international labor organizations in the absence of an agreement. In medication, and the least developed countries are authorized to suspend a certain patent and access to generic medicines in the event of a health emergency in development. It is agreed to analyze the situation of the least developed countries to strengthen the policies of intervention. According to my AI, it was really not considered to be a great success. Now we come to Cancun. I know that that's a place. Yeah. African cotton. I'd be presented and hear from Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, etc. Presented an initiative in which aimed at eliminating subsidies for the production of cotton in most developed countries, especially the USA, and specifically, and the subsidy for losses suffered in their countries. This proposal was finally rejected, which gave rise to the opposition of all the less developed countries, including the ACP, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states. Agriculture. The opening of the negotiations on the investment of competition due to failure in the agricultural sectors issues are reestablished. The least developed countries, especially the African countries, are included in this reduction. The more developed countries, although they are open to offering concessions to the least developed countries, are not willing to receive the same treatment as the developing countries, such as India, Brazil, and China. This round also becomes a failure. India, China, and Brazil, and the rest of the 29 developing countries call for a policy that would reduce agricultural subsidies and eliminate export subsidies. As this issue was not tackled, they decided not to sign the agreement. The US and Cairns Group found the proposal of the EU concerning the proposed reform of the agricultural policy insufficient. Now we come to Hong Kong. Okay. US proposes a reduction in American agricultural subsidies by 50 to 60%, but keeping a 5-year transitional form. And it is concluded that cotton subsidies should be terminated from 2006. Although, as reported by African producers, 90% of US production aid is of an internal nature. The EU, meanwhile, proposed a reduction in domestic agricultural aid by 46%, approximately, and the representatives from France were vigorously opposed to this idea. Now we come to Geneva. 2009, this conference implemented in its program a review of the organization's activities, as well as a debate regarding the role of institutions in economic recovery. Focuses on decision-making in 2 fundamental aspects: causes of non-violation of intellectual property and electronic commerce. It is agreed to exempt electronic transmissions, such as downloads of ebooks and software online, from tariffs. There are attempts to strengthen the multilateral system of trade through a document in order to examine the functioning, efficiency, and transparency of the organization, supported by many countries, including India, China, USA, and Brazil. However, this initiative is dismissed because of the disapproval of countries such as Cuba, Ecuador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. And it intends to reduce the tariffs imposed on exports among the 22 developing countries by 20%. Through this initiative, which aims to boost south-to-south trade, about 70% of manufactured and agricultural goods will be covered in a negotiation carried out by the General System of Tariff Preferences. Okie dokie, now we come to 2011, Geneva again. Most important issues raised were trade and development, Doha Development Agent, that's right, importance of the multilateral system of trade, and WTO. The various ministers who attended the conference expressed their willingness to maintain the balance between the rights and obligations of developed countries and emerging economies. Right, the difficulty of drafting agreements between the US and EU, and also among major developing countries such as Brazil, China, and India, especially on the issues related to agricultural market, was brought up. Some organizations have brought up the following emerging challenges: climate change, food security, trade and exchange, energy rates. An agreement concerning the least developed countries, the LDCs, was reached, and it addressed that the application of the rules of the WTO of intellectual property rights. The moratorium on non-observance of the rules of the agreement on trade-related aspects of the intellectual property rights expired in July 2013. However, it was agreed that requests for extensions could be properly justified and reviewed by the Council. IP and the TRIPS is intellectual property, okay? The least developed countries, the LDCs, required a more favorable treatment in the terms of services and providers from poor countries. In order to achieve this, it was necessary to convince members to apply a derogation to one of the basic principles of the multilateral trading system as follows: obligation to treat all countries in the same way. However, this idea was criticized for having little substantive value. Now we come to Bali. Decisions that were made in this conference are divided into two essentials: those that affect the functions of the WTO performs, and those that are related to the DOH development agencies. The main issues discussed were the following: trade-related intellectual property rights and TRIPS, and the aspects related to e-commerce. It was agreed to keep the non-application of customs duties to electronic transmissions between member countries, trade and transfer, technology transfer, trade help, work programs for small economies. Improvement of trade. An agreement is reached to encourage the reduction and streamlining of custom procedures, which results in a reduction of the costs that the companies must bear in their exports. For this figure is established, named authorized operators, so that the companies with a good record of compliance with the rules can benefit from special reduction in customs procedures. In addition, a regulation in customs procedures to avoid discrimination between countries is provided. On the other hand, a series of electronic procedures for the referral of documents and payment of fees is incorporated in a progressive manner, and thus exponentially expediting procedures. Now, in agriculture, agreements that include general service programs to achieve a reform of their territory or the security of a rural population are established. The emphasis is placed on developing countries, including their rural growth objectives and reducing poverty. A list of activities considered as a general service program was defined. Now, what is also created is a working group that carries out negotiations of an agreement involving a definitive solution for the storage of stock meeting food safety standards. As for the administration of quotas of rate amount, mechanisms are established so that private operators do not have the option of using such an allocated quota out of a personal interest. They are reallocated to other operators if a commercially correct mechanism is not followed. Mechanisms for monitoring subsidies and equivalent measures are established, and the debates are oriented towards the annual conference. The Committee of Agriculture are settled. Cotton. Here we go. Issues related to the export subsidies and equivalent measures, the national support of cotton and measures implemented in the least developed countries' exports are addressed. And in order to improve the transparency and monitor aspects related to cotton, discussions are held every 2 years within the framework of the Agricultural Committee. Now we come to the least developed countries. At the ministerial conference in Hong Kong, the rules of origin were introduced so as to facilitate the use of markets in the least developed countries, and in this way, developed countries and the least developed countries that are declared in a position to do so can afford to implement rules of origin to encourage the importation of products from these countries. What was also reached at this conference was an agreement to establish the criteria under which these rules must be developed, and also the need for rules to be transparent, simple, and objective was expressed. The agreement developed at the conference in Hong Kong about the establishment of measures in favor of least developed countries without tariffs or a quota limit is reviewed and modified. And then the agreements reached at this conference, which was classified as historic, helped the World Trade Organization regain its preponderant role in the regulation of international trade. And this is a biggie. Which one was that? Okay. I think this is, let's see which conference was that. Bali. Okay. All right. And let's go back to the words historic again, yeah? All right, there we go. Bling, bling, bling. Okay. Help the to regain its preponderant role and also grow towards the goals that it intends to achieve, contributing to transparency and foreseeing the increase in international trade. Now we come to Nairobi. The 10th World Trade Organizational Ministerial Conference was held in Nairobi, Kenya. It led to the adoption of the so-called Nairobi Package, a set of 6 ministerial decisions on agriculture, culture, cotton, and a range of least developed countries related issues. Here's now the results obtained after the conference were an extension of the agreement on IT. It was agreed to extend the agreement to 200 new products whose commercial transaction value represents $1.3 trillion annually. In addition, the phasing out of 65% of tariff lines in 2016 was implemented, with 89% eliminated in 2019, and with the rest expected to be eliminated in the next 7 years. Thanks to this expansion, the agreement will cover the annual trade of $3 trillion, accounting for 18% of world trade. That's kind of interesting, because if 3 is 18, 3 is 20, you multiply by 5, so $15 trillion is the estimated world trade, roughly. Agriculture to this is the theme of which greater achievements have been accomplished. As already mentioned, the conference concluded with the adoption of the Nairobi Package. Now, here's the things that were not happening before. Special safeguard mechanisms for developing countries, decisions concerning subsidies and other issues related to competition, decisions on cotton were made, storage of food and for 50 reasons. When it comes to these issues, it is important to highlight the reference of export subsidies, since it implies the commitment of all developed countries to stop subsidizing agricultural export, with the exception of dairy products and pork, which will be maintained until 2020. The developing countries will eliminate their export subsidies until 2018, except for some products, which will be eliminated in 22 and 23, respectively. Now, package of measures of the least developed countries. This package includes the following: more flexible rules on preferential origin, expansion of exemption services. As regard to preferential rules of origin granted to these least developed countries, up to 75% of the final value produced may be from non-originating countries. With regard to the preferential treatment according to the suppliers and the export of services from the developed countries, preferential treatment extends until 2030. Okay. New accession of Liberia and Afghanistan to the World Trade Organization. Somalia and Iran also have expressed an interest in membership. The Trade Facilitation Agreement, adopted at the historic, I might add, Bali conference. In order for the agreement to enter its force, it requires a ratification of 2/3 of the members. The last conference so far is the one held in Buenos Aires. The agreements reached at the conference, ministerial decisions on fishery subsidies, programs of work on electronic commerce, claims not based on an infringement, and claims in cases where there are another situation for the intellectual property, work program on small economies, and the creation of working group of Southern Sudan's accession assets. Okay.